Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Dr. Allyson Ettinger, who's a computational linguist and an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Chicago, working on natural language processing and computational cognitive modeling. Her interdisciplinary work draws on methods and insights from cognitive science, linguistics, and computer science to examine meaning extraction and predictive processes executed during language processing in humans and in artificial intelligence systems. Welcome, Allyson.
Hi, thanks.
I want to start with one of your earlier papers, and it's entitled Modeling N400 Amplitude Using Vector Space Models of Word Representation, in which you looked at the vector space models, VSMs, as explicit models of word relations that influence the N400. And the N400 is really is as a measurement of the EEG, right? Could you talk a bit about what N400 is, and then we can dig into what you found with the VSMs?
Yeah, so the N400 is a component of the human brain response that is used a lot by psycholinguists, by people who are interested in studying the language. And so when you're measuring the electrical signals of brain activity, what you see at about 400 milliseconds, peaking at about 400 milliseconds after the onset of a stimulus, as you're, for instance, reading one word at a time, is a negative going peak in the signal, which is referred to as the N400 component of that ERP response, of that EEG, measured by the EEG.
Yeah.
And what we seem to find accumulated over time in studying this signal is that the N400 seems to be sensitive to the extent to which the word that you are reading there fits with the context, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So to be more explicit, what you see is that the N400 can show, the default is for the N400 the default is to see that peak. But if you see that a word is particularly expected in the context, then you'll see a reduction in that N400 amplitude. So it can be an indication of how predictable a word is in context or how expected a word is in context. Okay. So psycholinguists like to use the N400 as an indication of how expected words are in context, and by manipulating that context, you can ask questions about what language comprehenders are expecting as they process those contexts.
Okay, so would it be right to assume, Allyson, that whatever we are measuring there is sort of a proxy for the effort spent by the brain? So if it is expecting something, or if it is the context is very clear, then you get one response. But if it is something unexpected or the context is unclear, you get a different response. So it's a proxy for how much effort the brain is spending.
Yeah, that's, I think, a reasonable way of thinking of it, and it's one sort of analogy that people have used. I think that that's a very sensible way of imagining this to be, essentially that if you're having to put in the normal amount of effort to process a word because you didn't expect it ahead of time, then you're going to see that normal sized N400 amplitude. But if you were able to anticipate ahead of time what word is going to come up and you're able to do that work ahead of time, then you might imagine that that reduction in effort may be the reason that we're seeing that reduction in N400 amplitude.
Okay, yeah. I remember reading something some time ago that beauty is it's a function of how much effort the brain has to spend, whether it's a painting or the face of a human being or whatever object you have. If the brain if the brain doesn't have to spend a lot of effort, so if it has symmetry, in different directions, then the brain defines that object to be more beautiful. It's that I know that you do a lot of work in cognitive science as well. Is that something that is related?
Yeah, I don't have any expertise in sort of the relationship between expectedness and beauty, so I can't really comment on that, but it's an interesting idea, certainly. I've seen just peripherally sort of theories about what the predictors are for what people will find beautiful. I have not seen myself any work connecting the N400 response per se to that type of work.
Okay, okay. So in this paper, vector space models, VSM, so you're basically creating a natural language processing engine, and then using that to look at what it is doing and how that is related to what the brain might be doing.
Yeah, so in that paper, basically, we constructed a very, very simple model based on vector space models of word representation. And we used that very simple model to test an alternative hypothesis that could potentially account for an observed pattern of results that had been seen in an N400 experiment. So the basic idea there was, in the experiment, they were looking at the N400 response to words in context, and they had contexts such as he caught the ball and scored a touchdown. There was nothing he loved more than a good game of. And now we have set up an expectation for what the next word might be, and they tried three different types of continuations after a context like this.
Yeah.
One was a continuation like football, which is the expected continuation in that context. Another was a continuation like baseball, which is not at all expected in that context, but shares semantic features
Mhm.
with football in that it's also a sport. And then the third continuation was an unexpected continuation that didn't share the same amount of semantic overlap, a continuation like Monopoly, which is a game but not a sport. So they looked at the brain response to these three different types of continuations across a number of different contexts. And what they found was that, and the critical observation is that often we have found that the N400 tracks what's known as close probability, which is how likely it is that a person would continue that context in a fill in the blank task with that word. So no one's going to fill in that context with Monopoly, and no one's going to fill in that context with baseball, and a lot of people are going to fill in that context with football. So you would expect basically to see a reduced N400 amplitude on football and not a reduced amplitude on the ones that are not expected, that is baseball and Monopoly. And the interesting observation in that study was that they did see a reduced N400 amplitude as expected on football. They saw a non-reduced amplitude on Monopoly. But even though baseball was not expected in the context, what they saw was that it showed this intermediate amplitude, suggesting a certain amount of facilitation being sort of a reference to what you were mentioning before about sort of making it easier to process this word. So this was curious, and there was a particular theory that these authors put forward about why this had happened.
Yeah.
And it basically said, oh, well, football was so expected in the context that your brain predicts it ahead of time. And because football is activated, so to speak, and because baseball shares features with it, part of baseball was activated. And that was why baseball also saw some
Mhm.
facilitation, also saw some reduction in the signal. And so what we were saying was, okay, well, that's one very interesting possible explanation for that result. But what if it's actually the case that you don't need to have predicted football
Yeah.
ahead of time in order to see a reduction on baseball? Maybe it's actually that there are some sort of indirect, maybe not completely obvious direct relationships between the words of the context and the word baseball. Even though baseball doesn't make sense in that context, maybe it actually could be the case that there are some connections between individual words in the context that may have increased the sort of passive expectation for baseball, what we might refer to as priming of baseball. And so what we took advantage of to test this hypothesis was these vector space models. I don't know if I should give a detailed explanation of vector space models.
Yeah.
Should I
Absolutely.
give a little bit of an,
Absolutely. Yeah.
all right, so vector space models, basically the idea here is we're going to make use of the distribution of words in their contexts and use that to derive a representation of those words and how similar they are to other words. So there's a famous quote, "You shall know a word by the company that it keeps," and you can think of this in terms of things like, if I see certain words and they always occur in the context of eat and spoon and delicious, then we might imagine that these have to do with food. And so this is the words that these words occur with can tell us things about what the word
Yeah.
means and what other words it might be similar to. And so vector space models are models that use statistics to derive vector representations of words based on their distribution and context. And then once we have these vector representations, we're able to use them to quantify the relationships between words.
So this is
And
like,
yeah,
Allyson, this is like word to vector, right? So you take a word
exactly.
and then you convert that word into set of numbers, essentially, a vector.
Yep, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Word to vec is one very prominent example of exactly this type of model.
Okay. And so you mentioned close probability. So close probability is that the chance of predicting the next word, right, in a sequence of words, that the chance of the next word being something, and so that probability should be sort of inversely related to the N400, because if it is completely unexpected, N400 amplitude will be higher and the probability will be lower, right?
Right, so a very high close probability often will correspond to a reduced N400 amplitude. Yep.
Okay. And so it's interesting. So what we are finding in the VSM model is that it is acting a bit like the brain, or is it too much of a jump?
I think we didn't want to go so far as to claim that it's acting like the brain, but in order to take seriously the results there and take that seriously as as a representation of the hypothesis that we wanted to test, we did need to go so far as to say as to take potentially seriously the relationships that that model produces between words. So basically, we say, all right, we're going to measure the relationships between words that are produced within this vector space. So we're going, so maybe banana and strawberry are going to fall close together in the space because they both occurred near similar words or something along those lines. And so we're essentially saying these types of statistically based word pair relationships, we're going to take those seriously as something that might also be instantiated in the brain. For instance, if the brain is also keeping track of co-occurrence statistics, it may pick up on similar types of relationships. And so it may also have, a similar type of relationship between banana and strawberry for similar reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we want to look and say, all right, we're going to use the fact that we have this model that's able to quantify relationships, and we're going to use that to try to say, okay, does baseball actually have a closer relationship to the words in that football context, like touchdown and pass and ball, than Monopoly does? And you can imagine, this is just one example, but you can imagine how that might be the case, right? Because baseball includes balls,
Yeah.
right? And things like this, and Monopoly does not. And this is just to give a very, very low level example. And we averaged over a number of different contexts, just the ones that we had access to. But yeah, the idea there was we didn't want to make a very strong claim. We certainly didn't want to make the claim that our very simple vector-based model was a perfect model of how language processing happens. All we wanted to claim was that if we can suppose that the brain may have access to similar types of co-occurrence statistics, and if the brain is making use of some similar sort of representation system, or at least if that representation system can approximate sort of priming effects that we might see, then that can present an alternative explanation for the result that they saw, because that was, once we ran that model, we were able to reproduce, roughly speaking, the patterns that they observed.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. If I wondered in the human context, if an individual only is engaged in baseball, so baseball then becomes sort of a proxy for any kind of sport, right? Because he is not interested in football or anything, just baseball. And so in the human context, the brain might just plug in baseball as sort of a proxy for any sport uh, into the context. It's sort of like a deep neural network that may be overtrained, perhaps. Did you see any effects of those types of things, or?
It's an interesting. It's. I think that part of what you're pointing out is that the commonality of being a sport may in fact be part of what underlies the fact that you see this effect. And this, I think, is in the same spirit as the original hypothesis put forth by the authors. And I think it's a very interesting one. In terms of relationship to overtraining of neural networks, I'm not sure that I've seen anything drawing an explicit connection between those things, but it's an interesting possibility. I think it's an interesting area of inquiry in general to think about the possibility that the predictive training that, for instance, language models are going through could bear some resemblance to the types of learning, sort of statistical learning that we do as adults just over time and through our various experiences that lead to these lower level brain responses that seem to reflect statistics in the environment.
Right, exactly. I want to jump into another paper that you have. It's entitled Spying on Your Neighbors, Fine-Grained Probing of Contextual Embeddings for Information About Surrounding Words.
Right.
So this is another NLP model, maybe a bit more complex. And you are, rather than using single words, you're kind of feeding the system, so to speak, the entire sentence, right? And then figuring out how words with the context around it, how those things are embedded into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first experiment that we've been discussing makes use of context invariant word representations, word vector representations, and the second paper that you've now mentioned is looking at representations produced by contextualizing embedding models, which feed in the entire sentence, exactly as you said, and then produce representations for each of the tokens, each of the words in the sentence, but those tokens reflect their context in some way. So to give a concrete example where we can imagine that this would be useful, there are polysemous words or homophonous words, like take the word bank. Bank can have multiple different meanings, and you as a human can tell which meaning is intended based on the context. So if I say I swam to the riverbank, I mean one type of bank. If I say I went to the bank to withdraw money, I mean another type of bank.
Yeah.
And so the idea, roughly, is that the model should be able to capture these types of differences in addition to a variety of other types of differences. And these models have been quite successful on a variety of NLP tasks. And so our idea in that paper was to examine, to use probing tasks, classification-based analyses, to probe and analyze the word representations, the contextualized word representations produced by those models, and try to get a clearer sense of exactly what information about the context they're capturing.
And you tried different encoders, right?
Yes.
So ELMO stands for embeddings from language models, GPT, generative pre-training, and more recently BERT, which I believe came out of Google, bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. I wonder if you want to talk a bit about transformers. I know that CNN, convolutional neural networks, and RNN, as well as the LSTMs, are all sort of inferior to, maybe I I don't know this, seems to be inferior to this transformers for from an NLP context.
Yeah, so the Transformers came onto the scene in
Hmm.
2017, and the really interesting thing about Transformers is that they allow us to process language, process sentences without recurrence, which is the sort of fundamental component of recurrent neural networks, which has been the prevailing way to process language up until the arrival of Transformers. So um, essentially, recurrent neural networks process words, process sentences one word at a time or one unit at a time in sequence, and then take the hidden states of the network and feed them back in at the next time step in order to keep track of a history. Whereas transformers do not make use of recurrence. Transformers were introduced in a paper called Attention is All You Need. And so these transformers make use of what's called an attention mechanism, which essentially is uh, a weighting function that looks at all of the different words of the sentence and decides how relatively to weight each of them
Hmm.
in processing across the different layers of the model, and then progressively produces different representations at each of the positions corresponding to the tokens of the sentence. And so these models are being trained in different ways, and they've shown significant successes. I don't know that we've really come to a final decision about what exactly, where exactly transformers outperform RNNs in terms of systematic analysis, systematic comparisons
Yeah.
of the two, but absolutely transformers have become very popular and have become sort of the predominant model at this point, since a number of popular transformers have come onto the scene and done very well.
Yeah, I read about this GPT-2, Allison. So this is
Mm-hmm.
byte pair encoding. Essentially, they're using subwords.
Yep.
In addition, you want to talk a bit about that? So this is sort of the latest thing, right?
Yeah, so using subword units can be useful in terms of getting around problems like sparsity in the representation of full words within the training corpus. And so, yeah, I honestly haven't seen systematic studies of benefits of byte pair encoding either, benefits of the different types of encoding, different formats that these inputs might take, but there are definitely some clear um, benefits that you might see from going below the subword level. When people were first looking below the subword level, often this was in terms of characters, and often people would draw a connection to possible benefits in terms of morphology, that is, uh, words, from a linguistic standpoint. It is very true that words have more internal structure below the word level.
Mm.
So you might imagine things like running, runs, ran, things like this. These words have things in common, and so you as a human don't necessarily need to memorize different meanings for running, runs, if you can just put together those pieces. So this is one sort of linguistically motivated type
Mm.
of reason that you might want subword units.
So it could be more efficient, perhaps, in some ways.
Yeah, it may be. In the end, it doesn't tend to uh, align perfectly with the way that morphology works. So that's certainly not the whole story, but yeah, I do think that it should improve efficiency to be able to focus on those subword components.
Yeah, the folks who are working on this, and I can't remember who they were, they said that they cannot release sort of the big model that they say has very impressive results because they fear that if it falls into bad hands, it could have some implications. Uh,
Yeah.
so, yeah, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that yeah, so that was the rationale that was given for not releasing GPT-2 originally, and I think that of course, in theory, this concern is entirely valid, and it's certainly important to be thinking about ethics in AI. This is absolutely true. I think that people were very disappointed in that perspective, in that what this also means if you don't release your model is that no one can really stress test it and see whether it's really as impressive as you're claiming just based on the paper or on a few examples. And shortly after, people just I think started training comparable models and larger models, and so ultimately it became a bit moot. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting conundrum if you think that you have a model that could be used for um, for ill.
Right.
Certainly being conscious of that is very responsible.
Yeah, I mean, the problem there is, of course, this type of technology is very difficult to keep it locked up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, if it's replicable, people will probably try to replicate it if they have the means.
Right, right. Yeah. So in this paper, you also mentioned, so I want to understand a bit more about it. So you say bidirectional context appears to impact distribution patterns more than depth or architecture, though the transform models show more robustness to distance. Do you want to describe a bit about what you mean there?
Yeah, and we had to be a little careful in how strongly we made those claims, since we were trying to draw conclusions from a fairly small sample size of
Yeah.
models. But we had GPT, which was a unidirectional model, and BERT and ELMO, which were bidirectional models. And then ELMO was also a shallower model and was also a recurrent model by contrast to GPT and BERT, which are transformers. So trying to draw sort of loose conclusions based on the comparative performance or the comparative patterns that we saw in terms of what information seemed to be captured and how it seemed to be distributed across words. We were finding, for instance, that ELMO, which was the one model of the three that was not a transformer, was showing less robustness to distance. We saw more of a drop when we added more distance in terms of the information that it seemed to be capturing at longer distances. That is a token that is farther away from the
Yeah.
word that we're the information of which it might be capturing. So that is, if you're probing for how far away we're seeing information about the word dog, if the word the is 6 words away with Elmo, it may be less likely to capture that
Oh, I
information
see.
about
Okay.
dog. So
Uh-huh.
so based on that, we made sort of the speculative uh, conclusion that this may be due to the fact that it's not among the transformers. And trying to remember which of the other ones was that you mentioned. The
Yeah.
bidirectionality. Yeah. So and then Elmo and Bert are both bidirectional, and those two patterned together to a substantial extent, especially when there wasn't intervening distance. There were certain little differences that we saw between them that were pretty interesting, but absolutely the GPT being unidirectional definitely substantially impacted the way that its information was distributed, both in terms of sort of in principle differences, where since it only has access to things to the left, it's not going to have um, any information about things in a direction that it can't see.
Yeah.
But also we saw some interesting patterns in terms of, for instance, it seemed to really prioritize the subject noun over the object noun
Mm.
to the point that the object noun seemed to have less information about itself than about the subject noun.
Mm. Yeah, so it's interesting. All three of these models, they are different concepts, different architectures. They all seem to have some level of performance, but then they are good at some things and bad at others. So at least on the surface, they seem to be learning and storing information quite differently from each other, right?
In terms of the three models that we
Yeah,
were
yeah.
comparing. Yeah, we definitely did see some interesting differences there, which we were excited about. And it's not necessarily easy to know precisely what to make of it, but in terms of the types of information that we tested for, it does have some interesting implications in terms of the priorities that these models have with respect to the particular features of the meanings and structural information about those words that they decide to sort of distribute in terms of contextual information that will be encoded on other words.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Allyson. I mean, you sit in a very interesting intersection of computer science and cognitive science. I was just wondering, from an evolutionary perspective, perhaps nature tried different techniques, abandoned some, improved on others, and now we have the human brain. But we may be able to find some earlier designs in animal models, right? Do we?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. In terms of is the question sort of whether we might see earlier evolutionary stages uh, in other non-human
Right.
animals that sort of resemble where we are in the development of AI?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially if you find some, sort of inefficient mechanisms in animal brains, and then we don't find that in the human brain. Perhaps we can conclude that that's part of the selection and evolutionary process. I'm just I'm just speculating here.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting idea. I don't know that we have evidence at the moment, and it may exist. I'm just not aware off the top of my head. I don't know that we have evidence at the moment for that being the case, but it's certainly an interesting idea. I think one thing that is interesting to think about is the extent to which um, sort of the number of units, the number of parameters available in a model should be compared to, for instance, the number of neurons in the brain. So I've
Yeah.
had colleagues speculate about, well, if we just increased the size of the models to um, such that the number of parameters is comparable to the number of neurons in the brain. I mean, is that going to get us farther? Is that really the main sticking point? And could the learning sort of organize things in such a way that we're able to arrive at the place, somewhere comparable to where we are in the brain? And I don't know the answer to this, and certainly we don't have reason to think that that these models we certainly see interesting parallels at various points between behaviors of the human brain and behaviors of these models, but alongside those, we always see divergences between the two. And so comparing them, I think, is very interesting. And I always say um, the most important level at which to compare them is when it comes to language or anything else that's uniquely human is in terms of the output. So when we're evaluating our models, it's not only sensible but essential that we compare against human outputs
Yeah.
because what it means to understand language and to do language correctly is really defined by the way that humans do. But in terms of whether the underlying mechanisms need to or ultimately will resemble those of humans, that's an entirely different question. I think the jury's still out.
Right. Right. Yeah. So based on what we know today, do we have any hypothesis as to the size of the brain and its capabilities? More neurons, more synapses. Does it unambiguously increase the capabilities, or do we have some sort of inverted U-type function that at some point adding more complexity to it actually creates more noise? But what do we know about that?
I think we have a lot more data on this from neural networks
Brains,
than
yeah.
from human brains. In that human brains, we're not going to be systematically varying the number of
Right.
neurons. The number of neurons is kind of going to be what it is, unless you mean comparing against animals, and then that would, in terms of size of brain and number of neurons available. Um, and so certainly there's an amount of complexity that we're able to recognize differences in when comparing across species. But yeah, in terms of being able to systematically vary that, I think that's something that we're kind of going to be restricted to doing in artificial models rather than in humans or really natural systems,
Right, right. In
period.
artificial models, though, is it true that the bigger the bigger the number of neurons you have in the model, number of layers, the bigger the better in artificial models?
It's not quite that simple, but we tend to see for a given model trained in sort of holding constant the way that it's trained. Um, as it gets bigger, we tend to see that the trend is that the performance improves. Now, we also tend to see the trend that we see the bigger models do better, and then people tend to um, produce work that tries to distill down to the sort of the essential parameters so that these models don't have to be so large and cumbersome. And so that's a pattern that, for instance, we might see with GPT-3 that just came out, which is a huge model. But we do tend to see in general the pattern that bigger models tend to have the capacity for better performance.
Okay. I want to go into another paper that you have, Allyson. So it's assessing composition in sentence vector representations, in which you say an important component of achieving language understanding is mastering the composition of sentence meaning. But an
Yeah.
immediate challenge to solving this problem is opacity of sentence vector representations produced by current neural sentence composition models. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this falls in the category of taking representations that are produced by these types of models and trying to better understand what information exactly they're capturing and what's in there. And in this case, by contrast to the contextualizing embedding study that we were discussing a moment ago, which was sort of just interested in general information that one might pick up on about surrounding words. Um, this composition paper was focused specifically on trying to find ways to do targeted evaluation of the extent to which sentence encoders, that is, models that are designed to produce generalized representations of sentences and presumably sentence meaning, the extent to which they are able to produce sentence to capture and encode sentence meaning in a compositional way. And so the reason that we were so focused on composition is that the idea behind composition is that human language is infinite because you can just take the pieces, individual words, for instance, and make them into any new sentence you want. So I can say something nonsensical like the giraffe recited the sonnet to the flight attendant. We had a nonsensical sentence
Yeah.
along those lines in the paper, and you know exactly what that sentence means because you know what the individual words mean, even though it's something that you've presumably never experienced. It's a very strange type of sentence, and presumably you've never heard it before. So the fact that you're able to do that is what allows language to be so expressive and for people to be able to understand sentences they've never heard before, etc. So this is something we wanted to test for in the models, is the extent to which they're able to capture compositional sentence meaning. So we did a lot of controls to try to ensure that that we were targeting and testing for sort of systematic capturing of these meaning components that couldn't be attributed to artifacts or memorization.
Right. So, one of the things I was thinking about. Let me ask you this. So, language sort of evolved, and there might have been a lot of errors. So it could be, sort of an aggregation of errors over time that became something that is useful to humans. But we have created some more systematic languages, like computer languages.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a lot easier to teach a machine a computer language than a human language?
Is it easier to teach a machine a
In other
programming
words,
language? Yeah.
understand a computer code and produce computer code.
Yeah. So to be clear, natural human language is highly systematic, but it's absolutely true that there are complexities and idiosyncrasies to natural human language that aren't present in sort of constructed programming languages. And so I don't know exactly what the analogy would be in terms of teaching a programming language. If you're talking about having a model just acquire a programming language in the way that we're trying to get it to acquire natural human languages, I, I have peripherally been aware of work with folks working on machine learning with code, and I think that probably it is an easier
Yeah.
task. I don't know exactly what the results look like since I've been focused on natural language in terms of my work, but it absolutely is true, your basic observation that the the certain amount of idiosyncrasy that we see in human language, and certainly the level of natural human language, certainly the amount of complexity, those are going to be less in programming languages. So yeah, absolutely, it is presumably going to be easier in principle to teach a programming language.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think if it's doable, Allyson. So as we get better and better in the NLP area, if we come to a point that there are certain things in the English language, let's say, it doesn't have to be English, but as an example, that makes it quite difficult from an NLP perspective to teach a machine. And so we are 95% there, let's say, and that 5% is left on the table. To get to that 5%, we have to maybe 10x the models. I wonder if there is an opportunity to go back and rationalize the English language, right? Because it over time it might have gotten quite inefficient.
I'm not totally sure, but I think that this sort of the speculation might be moving in the direction of, can we sort of modify the environment to make it easier to learn? Is that sort of
Yeah, I mean, we take the English language and say, if you were to remove 5% of the very complex, semantics and structural features of the English language, it becomes very amenable to NLP.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting idea, and it's certainly not the first time I've heard a suggestion along these lines, either for language or for other things. I remember a conversation about self-driving cars and sort of examples of adversarial inputs that you might see. What if someone painted a stripe on a stop sign or something, and it's difficult for the self-driving car for the model running the car to recognize it. And the suggestion was, well, why don't we just remove adversarial examples from the environment? And I think that this is probably not the way to go in the end, since these are sort of, sure, it would be easier to be successful that way, absolutely, but since humans are the ones using and producing language, and language, idiosyncrasies, and sort of, language is a sort of a living system,
right,
so to speak,
right.
and it changes on a daily basis, and
Yeah.
I think that those types of difficulties are going to keep being part of language. And so unless we want to force humans to try to force humans, that is, to sort of use language exclusively in a way that will be easy for
Yeah, I know.
for machines, that's probably not what we want to do. But it also it's definitely an interesting question. I think that trying to do that would really remove a lot of what makes language effective. So I don't think these are errors per se. These are just sort of products of the way that language works and is used.
Yeah. Hope I won't get a call from Webster's or English teachers. So I want to finish with your latest paper, which is what BERT is not, and you're using set of diagnostics on a pre-trained BERT transformer. So BERT is you go through kind of a two-step process, right? You have a pre-trained model, and then you customize it for a specific application. And I guess you're running some diagnostics on the pre-trained model.
Yep, exactly. So this new paradigm that has become very popular is to pre-train a model on a large amount of data using a task that doesn't require annotation, or a combination of tasks not requiring annotation. And then once you have this large pre-trained model, then you can fine-tune it on smaller amounts of data for particular tasks. And this has proved very, very effective. BERT advanced the state of the art across a wide variety of NLP tasks, and this was very impressive. And so a lot of people were wondering, including myself, what is it about the pre-training that picks up on such apparently generalizable information that can then support effective fine-tuning across such a wide variety of tasks?
Yeah.
So in targeting the pre-training model, the idea was to ask that specific question.
Yeah, and so you did a set of diagnostics on the pre-trained model. You found some of them as expected, but there were certain features, right? Certain aspects you found surprising.
Yeah, in terms of just the results that we
That's the
got
results
on.
like negation, for example.
Yeah, so I think that was one of the most striking results that we saw. So one of the diagnostics, and it's worth noting that all of these diagnostics were adapted from N400 experiments since they were well suited to looking at a predictive model. So one of the diagnostics was um, using sentences like a robin is or a robin is not
Yeah.
and then see what the model assigns high probability to in terms of those completions in that next position. And when you say a robin is a blank, the next word, uh, the model assigns very high probability to the sensible continuation of bird. In fact, if you just look in the top 5 continuations, it finds the correct noun 100% of the time, which was very impressive. But what happens is, if you then look at a robin is not
Hmm.
where really anything, almost anything but bird would be a correct continuation, the model really doesn't change much in terms of its top
Yeah.
predictions. So the top predicted words still contain bird, and it still assigns a higher probability to bird than, for instance, tree, which would actually be a true continuation in that case.
Right.
So what we took away from this was that the model really was not sensitive, at least not in a generalizable way, to the effects that negation has on a context in terms of what would be a reasonable and true continuation.
Yeah. So, and we see this in the human brain too, from an N400 perspective.
Yeah, so similarly, we find that there's a reduced N400 amplitude on bird, on bird, both in the a robin is a and a robin is not a context. So this raised, when this was identified as a pattern, this raised interesting questions in terms of the brain's processing of negation.
Yeah. So what's your hypothesis, Allyson? So, is the brain sort of jumping ahead? In this case, BERT as well. You see Robin, and you kind of, filling in the blanks, and then you see this not thing in there, and you have to basically completely reverse course. Is that what's happening? What exactly? What's your hypothesis?
Yeah, I think my take essentially is that the there isn't enough information there to make a good prediction, right?
Yeah.
So a robin is not is probably one of the least predictive contexts
Right.
we might be able to come up with, because almost everything, that's structurally sound, everything that's a noun, for instance, could basically everything could go there. And so I think that in the absence of a good prediction, um, the model really doesn't have much choice other than to try to predict something that BERT is predictive of, or sorry, Robin, that Robin is predictive of. And so something along those lines. So, it backs off essentially to something that is going to be helpful for making a prediction. And so this is totally reasonable and understandable from a perspective of what this model is trained to do, which is trained to optimally predict words in context. If not is not a helpful cue for making predictions, we wouldn't really expect it necessarily to make a lot of use of that. So, and I think that probably there's a similar type of explanation in terms of the N400. If the brain is not able to put together a sufficiently useful prediction, making use of that not component, it may just back off to more of a priming type of effect. But we do see in a follow-up experiment, and this was mentioned also in my paper because we had a diagnostic that looked at a similar thing. For certain contexts, you do see the negation having an effect if there's enough of a prediction that can be made there. I think that the speculation I made in the paper was that these contexts may actually be the types of things that the model has actually seen in its training. And I think that with humans, there's probably a similar type of explanation to be had with respect to those items where humans are able to just form a more informed type of prediction in a shorter amount of time.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. We don't do expert systems anymore. But if you think about this, this is probably the simplest of, sort of a heuristic that you could write as a rule, right? I was playing around with an archaic language called Prolog in the 80s, and in some early NLP type ideas. Here the prediction is anything other than the word. So, assuming that you have a set of random words, you could pick one of them. Anything other than a bird would work there. And you
Mhm.
just have to look for, this key called not. So I wondered, we have gone now away from those types of ideas into really empirically, teaching machines to find things. Is there any attempt to combine some rules and heuristics based stuff on top of what we are doing?
Yeah, there's certainly interest in that type of thing. People have absolutely tried to sort of wed more symbolic type reasoning with what's perceived to be less symbolic type of reasoning in neural networks. There have been some pretty heated debates about sort of the validity of assuming that these two things are mutually exclusive, and the validity of pursuing symbolic approaches. Certainly, and for instance, people have tried to establish whether neural networks might be learning rules, right? It's not out of the question that the types of rules that we might be able to come up with, exactly as you were describing, to just
Yeah.
put together a simple rule-based system. These could be the types of things in theory that these models could acquire during the learning course of the learning process. They can be a bit difficult to test for, but that really is exactly the type of thing that you would, thinking about the type of meaning that negation is, these sort of more logical, functional meanings of these operators. They tend to be sort of concisely expressed in terms of these simple logical rules, and so it does seem like the type of thing that we would like to be able to just sort of build the rule right in, and then it might solve this problem. And so, yeah, I think it's not out of the question that it could be a helpful direction to try to find an efficient hybrid
Yeah.
that would sort of go ahead and build those rules in, rather than trying to figure them out if they aren't easily acquired with the objectives we're using.
Yeah, it's I don't know what if it is having a low confidence in prediction, maybe you can kick in a heuristic, but this is not the case here. Actually, you have high confidence, but you're failing in the prediction, right?
Yeah, I think that the probabilities were a little bit lower in the negation case, but they were still,
Yeah.
reasonably high, I think. So I think that it's probably a bit lower confidence because the context has changed a bit. But yeah, it is certainly the second part of what you said, that it's failing. That's certainly true.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in conclusion, Allyson, that at the intersection of computer science and cognitive science, where do you see we will have the biggest impact in the next 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I think that there are a couple of directions in which these things can influence each other, and that I would like to see them influence each other. So the, the on the one hand, and so you were mentioning just now the possibility that sort of the types of rules that we can come up with as cognitive scientists, or as people that develop formal characterizations of these types of meanings. It would be nice if we could make use of those types of things to influence the design of our models, to, for instance, convert them into inductive biases that can make the learning process more efficient, as we tend to be of the mind that human learning of human language acquisition is faster. So it would be nice to be able to do this kind of thing, but I think that an even more critical way in which this direction of collaboration can go, this direction of sort of interdisciplinary connection, is sort of going back to something that I mentioned in passing earlier, is making use of what we know about the outputs that humans produce, the outcomes that humans produce in terms of these different cognitive tasks,
Yeah.
particularly language, and make sure that we're using those in a very controlled and intentional way to to assess our models effectively, because I think there are a lot of, we really have a lot of challenges right now in terms of effectively evaluating our models and knowing exactly what we need to look for and what we mean, for instance, by quote unquote understanding and whether we're achieving that, et cetera. It's a very complicated type of thing to even wrap your head around, much less to produce effective tests for. And so I think that cognitive science really has a lot to contribute in terms of that. In the other direction, I would love for us to get a little bit more of a handle on. We already see some work in terms of people comparing um, representations produced by these models or outputs produced by these models to the human brain with more of a cognitive science type of goal. The challenge there is that these models, there's so much that we already still do not understand about what's going on in these models, which makes it a challenge to use them as a proxy for cognitive hypotheses. So even to the extent that we see similarity between them, it's challenging to know exactly what to conclude based on that about the brain. So I think that we're going to see a lot more work sort of refining the approaches that we're taking and seeing what kinds of advantages we can get from the successes of these models in terms of learning more about how human cognition works.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. I was really fascinated, thinking about the N400 connection, right? And I wondered, are there other things like that we could utilize?
So when you say things like that, do you mean other brain responses?
Yeah,
or
getting, so we have a fairly clear hypothesis there. It sounds to me that when there is more complexity, less familiarity, you can see that amplitude go up. And I was wondering that similar measurements, whether it's part of EEG or something else, that might allow us to have a better picture, perhaps, what the brain is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are folks working constantly on trying to better understand the brain. And it's important to note that there's a lot that we still don't understand about the N400 component. And there absolutely are other components of the EEG signal that people also are studying. Another prominent one is known as the P600, which has other properties. There are various theories about exactly what's going on with that one, but often folks will study that one in tandem with studying the N400. So yeah, there's a host of different phenomena on the cognitive science side that potentially could be brought to bear in asking questions about NLP models, and there certainly is potential for using these newer NLP models to ask questions about, the types of questions that I've alluded to, things that we still don't understand about those components and about the mechanisms that produce them. We just need to be careful when doing this type of interdisciplinary work to make sure that we are very clear about the assumptions that we're making and the goals that we have, and make sure that the tools that we're applying are the right ones and not just the newest ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this has been great, Allyson. Thanks so much for spending time with me. And
yeah, of course.
Yeah, good luck with all your research at Chicago.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.